Welcome everyone to this PBEC and ESBN official side event of the 8th Asia-Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development 2021. My name is Michael Walsh. I'm the Chief Executive of the Pacific Basin Economic Council, which has been established in 1967 with its international secretariat based in Hong Kong since 2003. It is one of the oldest think tanks in the Pacific and Asia, connecting stakeholders, business leaders, NGOs and government officials together for typically closed-door roundtable dialogue discussions. Our focus is typically on trade and commerce related issues of common interest, which bring prosperity to its members and to the APAC region. It provides a unique platform of engagement that reaches across Pan-Asia and includes US, Canada, and Latin America. I do encourage those of you hearing about us for the first time or joining us for the first time today, or simply wish to learn more about today's speakers of this event, I encourage you to visit our website at www.pbec.org or connect with me directly on LinkedIn to follow or subscribe for our monthly e-digest with details of other public events. In a moment, I will introduce our speakers for this morning's virtual roundtable dialogue. But first, I wish to state some quick housekeeping items and share what the speakers will be covering for us today. Firstly, each of our speakers will be given the floor to make their remarks and comments on today's theme, a catalyst for change, providing us with their observations and describing what actions are being taken or are still needed on sustainable finance regional development across APAC. Whilst they are speaking, please don't be shy in submitting questions clearly indicated in the Q&A box to whom you wish to address your question to. And we hope to have 15-20 minutes at the end to answer those questions. Obviously, COVID-19 has dealt a devastating blow to economies, businesses and individuals alike. As a result of border closures, lockdowns and supply chain disruptions, early progress made in meeting Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, has backstepped. A recent UNESCAP report details the pandemic's impact on Asia-Pacic's countries' ability to fulfill their SDGs. But I won't go into all the findings, but highlight two in particular which matter to most of us. The first is jobs. The unemployment rate rose by 0.8 percentage points, leaving an additional 15 million people without jobs in the region. As many as 829 million informal workers within the region live in countries that had announced full or partial lockdowns during the height of the pandemic. These subsets of workers are mostly employed by SMEs, who often lack access to sufficient resources. This second item is environmental concerns. There has been a mixed outcome for the region's environment. Lockdowns led to short-term environmental recovery with less pollution levels due to reduced economic activity. However, the negative impacts quickly came back to the fore. There were marked increases in medical waste generation and concerns that loss of livelihoods may adversely heighten environmental degradation. So whilst we could all sit around and be decidedly depressed with such reports coming out about the past year and wondering what we can be doing, the objective of today's discussion is to provide some hope for the future in a COVID recovery and a few pertinent takeaways to spur actions and further ideas in the finance-related space. The 2030 agenda for sustainable development still requires financing to the tune of several trillions of dollars. But as with everything in life, it's all about having the resources, motivation and financing to produce impact on the scale now required. I'm therefore delighted to welcome an esteemed lineup of experts, all with a different lens on sustainable finance and its further development in the region. These include Pat Wu, Global Leader, Sustainable Finance, KPMG China. Pat will be setting the scene for us. What is sustainable finance? As it can mean so many different things depending on the audience. He'll touch upon the regulator's latest views and actions, capital markets adoption, and climate-related disclosures, and leave us with some food for thought. Then we'll hear from Kate Hodson, Head of ESG Legal and Partner at Ogiers Global, and a board member of the World Wildlife Fund, Hong Kong. Kate will talk about the rise in standards and accountability expected on fund managers when putting forward investment opportunities to their clients or evaluating a client's current investment portfolio. Kate will also highlight the alignment across jurisdictions and the taxonomy required still to help drive the adoption faster and what you would like to see happen further. Then we'll hear from Professor Masaru Yarime at the Hong Kong University Science and Technology Public Policy Division. Professor Masaru will be sharing his views from a policy-making lens, or a policymaker's lens, emphasizing the importance of encouraging all stakeholders to disclose their data to independent bodies or academic institutions like his. Also, what's the science and technology behind that can play its role in making informed decisions that are impactful. Then we'll hear from Pamela, representing the International Chamber of Commerce Advisory Group on Trade Finance, and is also the EVP of Knowledge and Applications at the Fung Group. Pamela is passionate about highlighting the plight of the SMEs during the crisis, as they make up the vast majority of the Asian economy's GDP, and yet have experienced the complete lack of financial inclusion from traditional banks and government assistance schemes. She will share some of the possible digital solutions to this problem, but also share some of the Trade Finance Group's concerns about how digital islands are forming, which is creating even more work for SMEs to compete on, amongst other issues. Then on to Yuki Yasui, Regional Coordinator Manager at APAC for the UN Environmental Programme Financial Initiative. Yuki, in her role, will be emphasizing how they provide solutions to financial institutions and corporations trying to attain targets being set by governments on net zero emissions and seek their commitment to alignment. Their most recent framework that released in 2019 on the principles of responsible banking has over 219 signatories already, which aims to assist the banking system and help industry demonstrate how they can make a positive contribution to society. Then on to, and not finally, but not least, Ben Gleisner, founder and CEO of CoGo, New Zealand and in the UK. Ben will be demonstrating how startups like his fintech firm can make an immediate impact in how we collectively can tackle climate change and reduce global warming, however small, by our own personal choices. There are now tools online like his available for us all to become far more aware about our life choices and daily consumptions of goods and services all around us. It's a great application that already 35 banks have signed up to in the UK. The likes of NatWest and Westpac in Australia already see the unique benefits to share with their customers. And finally, to our fellow host representative for today's event, it gives me great pleasure to hand over the floor now to kick things off by welcoming Dr. George Lam, Chairman of ESBN, ESCAP Sustainable Business Network Executive Council. He's also the Chairman of the Cyberport Hong Kong and Vice Chairman of PBEC. He holds several other very important roles and titles, which I won't go into right now, but I will hand now over to the floor for opening remarks to Dr. Lam. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think from Hong Kong, if I say good morning, it's very appropriate. But I know, participants come from all over the world, so good day to all of you. This is a very timely event, and I'd like to just say a few words about the ESBN. The UNESCAP is the largest organization for the UN, covering 62 states in Asia and the Pacific. And within that, there is a unique platform from the private sector. That's the ESBN. So it's the ESCAP Sustainable Business Network. Here, we are trying to promote and facilitate the private sector's participation, and in fact, driving for the achievement of the 17 SDGs. So the private sector has important means for implementing the SDGs, including finance for development and science technology innovations. But today's main focus is finance, and particularly sustainable finance. We've been talking about green bonds, we're talking about ESG investment, and the list is long. We're talking about impact investment movement. But at the end of the day, we like to see a catalyst for change. This change has to be immediate. Everybody knows about the problem of plastic in the ocean, for example, and the carbon problem that is a known given already. But what we want is a concerted effort as well from big companies, small to medium-sized enterprises, startups, and from the academic sector, from professional services, working together in a timely manner in order to really advance this agenda of sustainability. So on that note, I'd like to say that we are very pleased today that co-hosting this panel, we can see all forces put together, from the academic world, from SMEs, from professional services, from the UN family, and the business side, even startup, the fintech startup today. So thank you very much. Go for it. Now is the time. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And with that, actually, just before I hand over the floor now to Pat, we're just going to do a quick poll, which I'm going to launch here. And I'd like the participants and also the panelists to answer question 1, if I may. Hopefully you can see that on your screens. It's a multiple choice question. So the question is, in order to unlock the investment potential that Asian fixed income has to offer on this front, what are the right tools required to be put in place still by investors and government? So if you have more than one requirement, please tick more than one. And then you don't need to answer question 2. We'll leave that for later at the end after hearing from the panelists. But I'll give that 1 minute. And as I do, I'm going to hand over to Pat so people can be voting while they listen to Pat Woo. Pat Woo, over to you if you want to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Dr. Lam, for kicking off this session on a catalyst for change. And the title of this webinar is also the same title as a publication that KPMG together with ESBN and PBEC did middle of last year, called A Catalyst of Change and How to Steer Sustainable Finance in the Region, to kind of to accelerate the market. And as Mike has mentioned, we need trillions of dollars of investment to really make this transition from a carbon heavy economy to a low carbon economy. And that is already happening around the world. And we've seen that countries in the region, Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, China, and Singapore have all kind of like made these net zero commitments in predominantly 2050 and 2060. And so, I think ultimately there has been at that national level those commitments that countries have made. And from that perspective, what does that mean for the market? And I think that, in the end, the governments cannot do this by themselves. I think that a lot of the time we in the market may not feel that we have much that can be done for climate change. But I think that the capital market has a pivotal role to play. And really, how are we going to be able to bring more private capital to participate in this market, because I think in the end, where's this trillions of dollars going to come from? Governments globally are already under the cosh from the COVID pandemic, and really doesn't have that budget to be able to deal with these things. So private capital participation is going to be critical. And the paper was really kind of like steering towards, well, how can we accelerate more of the private capital moving in this direction? And I do really think it's already happening. And the paper was really showcasing some of the kind of like key initiatives that has happened, and we've seen that it's moved in that direction through the shift and the move of certain pension funds and certain sovereign wealth funds around the world, and also certain regulators around the world, and how they're kind of like working together to bring about a more coherent market for sustainable finance. And so, I mean, as an example, Japan. In 2017, GPIF, the Government Pension Investment Fund of Japan, which has over $1 trillion of investment, said that they're going to integrate ESG into their investment decisions, and they will be requiring all asset managers that try to get mandates from them to have ESG integrated into their investment process. So when the biggest asset owner in the nation, GPIF in Japan, comes out and says this, then everybody moves. And what we've seen is in the Japanese market that the ESG investment market has had a CAGR of over 300% for the past several years, and grew from 8 billion in 2014 to now at over 2 trillion US dollars equivalent. So taking that as an example, we feel that other pension funds and sovereign wealth funds can do similar acceleration in their market. And Hong Kong Monetary Authority, that runs the exchange fund, which has over 500 billion US dollars worth under investment, and the de facto kind of like sovereign, city's wealth has already made that announcement, and as such, the asset management industry here in Hong Kong is also moving in that direction. Singapore and Temasek and others have made not concrete moves, but I think that they have already steered in that direction. So I think pension funds and sovereign wealth funds with their big pockets can really help accelerate the market, and that was really what that paper was predominantly about. And moving on to the regulator side, I think, we've seen some seismic shift of regulation in the key markets around the region. Here in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority has requested all banks to do stress testing and scenario analysis for climate change. And so we've seen, at KPMG, a flurry of activity from the banking sector to really understand what risks there are in their loan books. And the SFC, the Securities and Futures Commission here in Hong Kong, has also completed a consultation on requiring all asset management licensed companies to disclose their climate-related risks and opportunities as part of their global reporting. The consultation results will probably come out around June this year, but I think that no doubt the direction of travel is definitely in this direction of really kind of like getting the market to move. And it's really, so it's not a surprise, simply because the world is moving in that direction, led by the EU. And if we are to kind of continue to operate several international financial centers here in Asia, we have to keep up with the pace of development in the ESG. And this is critical for the growth and the transition of Asia as a whole, as we also see a lot of private sector initiatives moving towards this net zero commitments that they're doing. For example, KPMG ourselves, we have committed to net zero by 2030, and a number of different organizations, and I was just checking online, over 155 global corporates have already signed up to Science-Based Target Initiative, which is really effectively saying that they're going to align with the Paris Agreement on their corporate developments. And that in turn will mean that all of these companies will be held accountable on their activities and how they're going to decarbonize their own operations and their supply chains and their activities going forward. So, with that in view, I feel that, the sovereign wealth funds, pension funds would like to see more of that activities moving into that sustainable finance space. The regulators are already moving, and I've alluded to kind of several regulators in Hong Kong and also in Singapore really doing quite a lot. The private sector is moving, and I think it's imminent that this is something that is not a fad. It's not something that is just happening right now for a while. It is one of the mega trends that is happening globally. And this underpins what was said in the 14th Five-Year Plan by China, where, kind of green and decarbonization of the economy is one of the three big topics of the 14th Five-Year Plan. So it and a giant of China is going to really have huge implications on how the capital markets and the economies of the region are run. So with that in view, I feel that we hope that things will continue to move in this direction in an accelerated manner. I've been in the ESG space for 14 years, and I do see, acceleration in the last 18 months. And really, the capital market is listening and responding to the demands of what we need to do to convert into a lower carbon economy. So with that, I pass it back to Mike, and I hope that sets the scene for other panelists today.
Thanks, Pat. And while you've been speaking, obviously people have been voting on our first polling question before. I think it's pertinent just to mention as we bring in Kate in a second, because one of the things that scored very highly was ESG rating firms require regulating in the same way as credit rating agencies. And I feel that's something perhaps that Kate maybe want to touch upon with her background, knowing what is required. And we mentioned about standards, and sort of making those standards more relevant across borders, not just national standards. So Kate, if you'd like to unmute yourself, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, pleasure to be here. Thank you again for inviting me along to speak today. I think I've got about 8 minutes or so. So in that time, I'm going to try and narrow down my topic a bit and look specifically at the context of climate change and the asset management industry here in Asia. So we know that the deep economic changes are necessary to achieve the Paris Agreement objectives, that these require a significant and consistent reallocation of resources. We know the financial sector has a key role in tackling climate change. But what I want to look at really is how that's playing out in Asia, specifically how Asian asset managers and investors are responding and being that catalyst for change, respectively. One aspect I find particularly promising is that we are diversifying our product bank away from just green bonds and loans now, with more attention being given to the asset management industry here in Asia. In Hong Kong, you'll be aware of the consultation on the mandatory changes to the Fund Managers Code of Conduct that Pat touched upon earlier. These impose requirements around integration and management of climate risk. In Singapore, the approach has also been taken by the regulator to focus on risk, but in the context of broader guidance under the guidelines on environmental risk management. In China, we've also had guidelines introduced. This specifically focused on green investments as reflected in AMAC's green investment guidelines and so on. But what of the investors in the region? Pat also touched on the fact that we've seen large dominant investors picking up the mantle. So for example, Temasek, GPIF, HKMA, as you mentioned, and others. In China, we now have over 20 China-based asset management companies signed up to the principles for responsible investment. But I work as an investment funds lawyer. I've been with Ogiers in Hong Kong for about 11 years now. And so I can sort of maybe touch on anecdotally what we're sort of seeing on the ground. So, what of the many family offices and private high net worths out here in Asia? our clients are seemingly not yet consistently getting hard-pressed questions on ESG questions. They are receiving due diligence questionnaires, but many of them still feel this is a more tick-the-box exercise. We certainly have seen more significant flows into sustainable investments in the region, but the selection process can potentially lack rigor. There may be more demand, but do investors know to ask the right questions across the board? And I would say that there is still a lot of inconsistency here. Of course, this has all happened in short time frame. There has been rapid changes, so this is to be expected. On the manager side, it's not just investor driven. We are seeing managers make the move towards ESG investing on their own accord. But of course, again, we see inconsistency here. In fact, there was a relatively sort of heated reaction, I would say, to the SFC's proposals in Hong Kong on the climate change consultation paper. Many managers, I think, felt that it was not necessary to mandate special treatment for a particular type of risk, perhaps felt that this was coming in too soon when the data is just not there yet. But of course, this risk is unprecedented, of global proportion, and most critically of all, just not reflected in asset valuations as yet. If we think about it, AML, anti-money laundering, as an example, is an issue of, again, global proportion. It rocks the integrity of the financial system as a whole. And managers and financial institutions have had to do their part to look at that risk across the board. They may justify that the risk is low in a particular case, and so they have applied simplified procedures in that case. I think we have to accept that we are now there with climate as well. Robeco, the Dutch asset manager, recently completed a survey of about 300 investors across Europe, North America, and APAC. And they found that whilst climate change is a significant factor in the investment policies of around 73% of global investors, only 17% of those have set net zero targets. As Pat mentioned, we are moving in this direction, and it's great to see so many picking up the mantle. And one positive result that came out of that survey was that 52% of investors were looking to set a net zero target within the next 5 years. But they found that 44% of respondents felt that the lack of data and reporting was one of the biggest obstacles to implementing decarbonisation. So on management of climate change risks, regulators have certainly in Asia had to step in and drive this to ensure that managers are looking at climate change, because this has not yet sufficiently been considered in financial statements or included in part of the risk management processes to date. I think without these efforts from regulators in the region, it was going to be too slow to see the change that we really need. So back to what we're seeing from managers in the APAC region. From what we see, there is a lot of efforts and focus on ESG integration now, together with some thematic investing. This is reflective of the view that fiduciary duties require consideration of how sustainability issues affect the investment decision. But we haven't yet reached that next generation of responsible investing in Asia, which is looking at how investment decisions affect sustainability issues. And we're just not there yet in any kind of consistent manner. Indeed, we're probably not there yet on a global basis. But this is something that the legal framework for impact is looking at, namely how we manage impacts of investments on sustainability issues as an evolution of the responsible investment. What we probably need to see more of in Asia is asset managers going out of the way to set golden standards when constructing funds intended to make quantifiable positive impacts on environmental or social issues in an accountable manner. We've been advising the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF Hong Kong, on its environmental consultancy appointment to the Mill Trust Managed Climate Impact Asia Fund. This is a fund that invests in listed stocks and constructs its portfolio such that it invests in companies which have the objective of contributing towards the adaptation or mitigation of climate change and or the transition to a low carbon economy. We've been working with them to look at ways that we can incorporate elements of the so-called golden standard into their fund documentation. And in fact, this fund has already won an award from the Environmental Finance publication last year. In addition, Mill Trust also aims to make revenue-based donations from the fund to WWF Hong Kong's conservation programs. I'm not aware of any other open-ended fund, so investing in listed securities in Asia, that is focused on climate change with the same approach. But these approaches, certainly approaches looking at impact, whilst being critical, as they tend to be the ones moving the needle in terms of impact in the real economy, these approaches certainly have increased cost associated with them. Perhaps regulators could look at ways where we could incentivize and support managers on their journey, particularly the startup and small to medium-sized managers, which make up a lot of the asset management industry here in Hong Kong, certainly in terms of number, even if not in terms of AUM. Could tax breaks be available for a set period of time? Could there be a mechanism to fast track licensing, or are there other areas of support that could be given? In some jurisdictions, there could even be legal impediments to this approach. And so that might require some policy changes first. I noticed, I'm just looking at my time, so I have come up to my 8 minutes. So I was just going to make one last point on the taxonomy. I feel that the taxonomy is important for providing clarity on green, but a taxonomy has to be flexible enough to enable innovation. Singapore have released a consultation on their taxonomy, which I believe is largely intended to be aligned with the EU taxonomy. We also have the Asia Taxonomy Alliance to looking at creating consistency. I think what is useful here is that with this progression, investors considering investments in financial products labeled as green under Asian rules can gain some confidence that it also meets environmental and sustainability standards in other jurisdictions, including the EU. But perhaps there will continue to be some differences. And in my view, the investment world can probably adapt to that. It does require some gap analysis, but certainly with more consistency, that creates greater efficiency. Specifically in Hong Kong, I know that we're heading towards an aim to adopt the common ground taxonomy, which is currently being worked on. So just to sum up there, I think the message is positive overall. We are seeing a huge amount of change, particularly in the last year. But I think we need to be careful not to overstate that change. There still needs to be greater focus on kind of consistency around standards and sort of example setting in the region. I haven't got to data yet, but if there's time later, maybe we can pick up on that discussion a bit later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. And some really good points there that obviously, for the essence of time, we can't go into huge detail, but that's sort of the areas that we would typically under PBEC would go into more detailed discussions. As you mentioned, more dialogue is required, more clarity and standards. So with that, I would like to hand the floor, if I may ask Professor Masaru Yarime to switch on his camera. There he is, and unmute himself. And Professor, we're now going to sort of change tack a little bit from a more academic point of view and policy side. Love to hear your thoughts on what you think needs to be done, especially on the data sharing part that we talked about. Thank you so much. Over to you. The floor is.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. I'm very pleased to be invited to this exciting opportunity to discuss key challenges and opportunities in sustainable finance, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. I have been working on basically science and technology innovation policy for tackling energy, environment, and sustainability issues. And increasingly, as you see, kind of emergence of data, big data analytics and data-driven innovation, particularly utilizing AI for decision making. So today, I'm just going to focus on the role of open data for facilitating sustainability through working with the stakeholders in society, so that we can somehow try to utilize the huge opportunities provided by open data in recent years. So open data has been promoted particularly in the public sector. And here we can think about open data as digital data in a machine readable format, so that this data would be available freely, openly, flexibly for particularly for the public and anybody in society without having any restrictions. And increasingly, the new technologies would make it possible to monitor things on the real-time basis, so that we can adjust our activities and behavior reflecting what is happening in the world. So open data generally is very important to strengthen accountability and also increase trust of citizens. And also by making data available, so other stakeholders can build up new services, and also that will help the people to make better decisions. And open data, generally speaking, would require the complete data and reproducibility, and also uniqueness for primary data, and also the metadata, so that the users can use data available openly by knowing what kind of data is it. And I think if you look at some examples with regard to environmental issues for open data, and then we can think about some case like toxic release inventory of US EPA, so that the stakeholders can look at the emissions of different kinds of chemicals from production plants and facilities, so that that would really enhance the trust of the citizens living nearby. So that we really appreciate the kind of the openness, and that will enhance the trust of citizens with regard to the activities conducted by companies. And also, I think in the case of Europe, the European Chemical Agency is really in charge of organizing the REACH, the registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. That will also contributing to the enhancing the trust, so that the stakeholders can understand the activities of chemical companies. So I think increasingly the disclosure of corporate data on sustainability is expected, as mentioned by the previous speakers, and that is happening. But if you look at the practices now, mostly corporate sustainability reports are provided in PDF files, or maybe put some presentation slides on the website, but they are not really machine readable in the sense that it's not easy for the other stakeholders to utilize the data disclosed by companies. And especially in recent years, there's an increasing demand for sustainability data and exchange of data from investors and the financial institutions for evaluating all the activities and behavior of these companies, and then to evaluate the risks involved. And I think at this moment, there are many intermediaries like ESG research, the institutes and rating agencies, and also information providers and brokers. And they have their own specific ways of collecting data and interpreting data. And that creates kind of the diversity. But as we have more demands for wide range of issues, particularly increasingly, we need to pay more attention to the social dimensions. These areas are not necessarily well standardized. So there are many opportunities available for other stakeholders to come in and then to use the data and then analyze the data and then interpreting different kinds of data. So in that sense that we need to really make the data available for a wide range of the people with and organizations with the different expertise and experience. So in that sense that increasingly we need to think about the issue of data accuracy, reliability, and completeness, and also the regular update of data provided by companies. And then we need to look at the carefully the kind of gap between disclosed data and also actual performance, so that there are some criticism about potential greenwashing in sustainability reporting. So I think by making data available, open to the public in the end, then we can really scrutinize the potential discrepancy between disclosed data and also actual performance. And also investors and financial institutions will have a different need for data depending upon their own focus and their own strategy. So also in that sense that it's very important to make the data more open and available to a wide range of stakeholders. So there are the potentials for utilizing open data for sustainability, and as increasingly a lot of data will be digitized, so that the digitized data can be used for internal monitoring and control for the companies themselves, and also increasingly real-time monitoring is getting possible. So that is also very important for the corporate management to really be aware of what is really going on their operations, and then that they can make their decisions flexibly and quickly. So in that sense, probably open data itself could contribute to facilitating a kind of self-regulation of corporate sustainability performance. That will be increasingly emphasized in many studies, which show that self-regulation can actually improve the performance of the corporate sustainability in the long run. So in that sense that probably open data, particularly digitized open data, would make it possible for the companies themselves to provide the necessary information and also incentives to improve their sustainability performance. And also by making the data open, that would make it possible to kind of benchmarking within the sector and also across sectors. So that would contribute to monitoring and managing the achievement of sectoral goals and agreements, and also probably international goals and agreements.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for those comments. I just want to move it along a little bit. So I've taken key points from your findings there, and I do agree. You know, open data for sustainability is going to continue to be a key area. And I have to say, you've raised a crucial point, is that a lot of these corporations, public corporations, are producing reports, as you say, uploaded to their website, but they're not necessarily friendly for third parties to use. So with that said, I'm just going to move it along, Professor, if you don't mind, on to Pamela Ma now, who's joining us on behalf of ICC International Chamber of Commerce. So thank you, Professor. We'll come back to you maybe a bit later on. So Pamela, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon if you're in New Zealand. Basically, I'd like to begin by just stepping back a bit and thinking about the trillions of dollars of investment that Pat mentioned, and the different ways in which it is classified and channeled, which is what Kate talked about, and really think about for these $1 trillion, who is actually doing the work? Okay, and what I'm talking about is, you know, when we talk about the SDG agenda, who is creating the jobs? Who is upgrading the energy? Who is actually doing the work on the ground, making sustainable products and so on, which are all feeding to the SDG agenda? And the answer for all of these questions is actually the small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. And that's both on the social side in terms of job creation, and the data is well known. SMEs create the majority of the jobs in many of the Asian developing economies, as well as a significant portion of the jobs in some of the middle income and developed economies as well. And they are critical players in every supply chain, or in great majority of supply chains run by multinational companies who are making all of the big headline-grabbing commitments to the SDGs. And so basically the message is that the welfare of SMEs, and you know, just in terms of definition, so a small and medium-sized enterprise, it could be anywhere from you know, a few to like 2,000 workers, usually revenues not more than 10 million or 20 million US dollars. So this is the size of enterprise, and you know, which is critical to both the economy as well as to the achievement of the SDG agenda. And the plight of SMEs and the welfare of SMEs has actually become really into relief during the COVID period, because COVID has obviously hit them quite hard. We, through the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, and the Advisory Group on Trade Finance, we have been doing structured ethnographic interviews of SMEs, because we are concerned about the flow of finances, or rather the lack of flow of financing to the SME sector during COVID, and then what can be done to address this. The ADB has already established there is a $1.5 trillion gap in trade finance going to SMEs, and we think that as much as $5 trillion of financing will be necessary to restart the economy, restart supply chains, so that the world can get back growing again. We are finding in our interviews that SMEs have 4 critical problems. Number 1, obviously liquidity. They can't get access to financing despite all of the QE and all of the subsidies which are being released on the market. Somehow these aren't getting down to the ground level. Number 2 is complexity, in that the processes for trading, the processes for getting financing are very analog. They're very complex. They have a lot of hoops to get through, and sometimes SMEs just can't master those. The third is growth, in that they can't get financing to invest in automation, invest in getting new customers. And the fourth is institutional capacity, which is in terms of training their employees and also training their counterparts in the financial institutions on what are the needs of SMEs. The point is, we cannot accelerate the SDG agenda without actually addressing the SME agenda. So in our work, we've come upon a couple of solutions, which I'm going to propose to you. The first is more digitization, that if we can do things like legalizing e-documentation, moving ahead on a universally accepted digital identity, this would actually free up and provide access to SMEs to more sources of financing. And I would note that actually ESCAP is doing a lot of work on paperless trade, which is really important to make it easier for SMEs to trade internationally. The second is to, and it's a real challenge to financial institutions, is that how do you begin to assess risk of SMEs in a different way? Which is to say that usually when financial institutions are looking at lending money, they're assessing the risk of the borrower according to their balance sheet. So naturally, if you have a bigger balance sheet, you have a bigger company, then you have more access to finance. And SMEs, because they don't have a lot of assets, and because they don't meet these kind of risk requirements, they are naturally excluded, and then they're forced to look for alternative sources. So there have been a couple of moves, a lot using data, and so maybe the open data movement that Professor Yarime referred to can be part of this, is that you begin to assess borrowers based on transactions, based on real-time data. Some of this has been tried in China as well, but we need to do more work there. The third is to find new sources of liquidity. How do you channel a lot of the ESG investment and impact investment to be basically targeting the SME market? So not just looking at the big companies who have made the big ticket commitments to net zero or what have you, but looking at their supply chains and seeing how do you support the SMEs to really step up and participate in the SDG agenda. So that's my appeal, is to basically bring the SME view into the SDG agenda, because the best performers and those who we need to move aren't always the biggest companies. So what does this mean for you? If you're a big company, and one of those who have made commitments, or you're trying to make a commitment, think about your supply chain. Think about how are you going to get more resources to the small and medium-sized enterprises who actually do a lot of the work in your value chain. If you're an investor, think about the SMEs as well, because you can make a lot of change by targeting the small and medium-sized enterprise market, and really go internationally, because many of the SMEs, they trade internationally and they are resource constrained. And yet they have huge potential for growth. The third, if you're a standard setter, if you're a policymaker, think about different ways to continue the task of digitization of trade, of digitization of finance, because fundamentally digitization is about democratizing access and democratizing the flow of liquidity, so that it's not all bound up in a set of institutions with very fixed standards, not because they are fixed in these, but because that's the way the regulation is set up. So regulators need to move, and policymakers need to move as well. And digitization is a key agenda which can really help move the flow of financing to SMEs. So that's all I have. I'm happy to discuss, I'm happy to receive questions on why SMEs should be a big part of our focus when we talk about the SDGs. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Pamela. And we are starting to get some questions, so I do encourage the audience, to write them in the box, and we'll see if we can get to them at the end. And maybe something for you to think about, Pamela, but not necessarily answer right now, because we're going to bring in Yuki. But somebody's asked, how do you think about monitoring micro and family-based companies, I guess, in the context of gathering data as well? So we can maybe think about that for later in the session. So I'd like to now hand the floor, if I may, over to Yuki Yasui, who's with the United Nations Environmental Programme Finance Initiative. The floor is yours, Yuki, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah. Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And thanks very much to ESBN for inviting me. I remember joining an ESBN conference about 2 years ago in Bangkok at the UNESCAP building. And I hope that one day soon we will be able to meet in person again. But very glad that we are meeting here today virtually. So my presentation is mainly about the principles for responsible banking, and explaining why. So just to go back, the UNEP Finance Initiative has developed over its 28 years history, 3 key voluntary principles that define sustainable finance. The first one is the Principles for Responsible Investment, which was launched in 2006, and today it is it's as an organization they have developed outside of the United Nations and is now supported by UNEP-FI and Global Compact, but is a separate entity. The Principles for Sustainable Insurance developed and launched in 2012, and then the Principles for Responsible Banking is the last and the latest voluntary principles around what is sustainability in the banking context. And that was launched in 2019. And today we have over 219 signatories around the world from 47 countries and representing about 40% of the banking industry in terms of its total assets. The main principle, the first principle, is about alignment. So banks that sign up to the Principles for Responsible Banking commit to aligning their business strategy to Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement and other societal goals. And in order to implement that, they are measuring this implementation by impact. So how does the bank impact provide positive and negative impact to society and the planet? And how can they reduce the negative impact and increase the positive impact? Now, just to make it clear, because it does get confused quite a lot, is we're not talking so much about the impact of the operations of the bank. So we're not, when we say like net zero for banking, we're not talking about the net zero of carbon emission of their scope 1 and 2 of their operations. So we're not looking at their building, how much the electricity they use or how much business travel they do, but we are really looking at the loan portfolio and saying what are the negative impacts that are coming from their financing, and how does it affect the people and the planet. So what I really want to say in today's intervention is, why is alignment and impact becoming something that is interesting for businesses and for banks around the world? Because this is not just the PRB that is saying it. You are seeing a lot of businesses around the world talking about impact and the need for alignment. And where does that come from? We are no longer talking about it in a very CSR type of tone. We're not doing this as a side issue for the banks. We are expecting the banks to really look at their business strategy and to directly reflect on their product development and their financing decision-making process. So where does that come from if it's not coming from charity or from PR type of motive? I think there are two things. One is from the financial regulation. You can see that financial regulators around the world, as in the case of the greening of the financial system, you can see that climate change and other environmental social risks have become a systematic risk for the finance sector. That's something that financial regulators are worried about. Now, what they've come to realize, though, is that you cannot completely manage the climate risk, that these risks, these new emerging risks, are global and systematic. And as such, banks or other financial institutions cannot manage them away. Like in the past, risks like pollution from factory discharges to the river, you could put something in there to stop it and manage it. But for climate change, there's a lot of big dynamics means that one company cannot solve the whole situation, and they cannot manage away the whole situation either. Meaning that although climate regulation for financiers have started with risk, they've now started to move into the opportunity side as well. They've realized that if you don't encourage transition finance and green finance, and to move the whole portfolio away from the brown economy to the green economy, the climate change risk will persist. So that's coming from the financial regulator's perspective. The other one is the policymaker's perspective. We have, as mentioned by Mike at the beginning and by other speakers, that we're seeing these net zero commitments by governments in Asia and around the world. Where is that coming from? And I think there's a lot of, strong support that innovation in the next 50 years is going to come from solving environmental and social and governance issues. So by reducing your carbon emissions, for example, you are doing favor for society. And if you're able to reduce other people's emissions, you are doing further favor to society and the planet as well. And the climate change and other in environment and social issues are becoming a source of competitiveness for countries, and the technological development and business innovation can grow from solving environmental and social issues. So the idea that environmental and social issues are just a cost to economic growth is now being changed to say that, to understand that environmental and social issues, solving those is providing service to society, but is actually creating the economic growth and the international and the national competitiveness as well. So that is the reason why corporations are looking at society more, thinking about what kind of negative and positive impact they are making and how they can improve their position so that they are better aligned. But what that ultimately means is they want to be more, they see the growth potential from these activities. They're not doing it for charitable reasons anymore. So I think that is my time up now. So I'll be happy to answer questions and have further discussions with the panel. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Yuki. And again, some great points raised there, which I'll just quickly mention as I hand over the floor to Ben in a second. Solving social environmental problems, can provide service to society and economic growth, and reducing your emissions, your own and for other people is all beneficial. And that's why, banks are looking at the positive and negative impact. And I think it's a great segue to finish of our panel speakers with Ben, who's a founder and of a startup fintech company all the way in Wellington, New Zealand. He joins us this afternoon from New Zealand. Welcome, Ben. And he's going to talk about and share on the screen his amazing app, which definitely is in the positive side, I would think, of all the banks. And so let's really excited to see and hear from you, Ben. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Michael. I'll start the timer. Good to be here. I guess before going on to the fintech side of things, previous sort of life, my degree was in environmental science. I did my master's in climate change economics about 16 years ago now. So I've been thinking about climate change and sustainability for a long time. I led the New Zealand government's work around climate change, and then led the work done in New Zealand around how we should measure progress beyond GDP. So all the well-being work, all the sustainable development sort of framework work was led out of Treasury. So I was an economist at the Treasury. But it was while I was at Treasury doing all the stuff around, creating more climate change than I think I was solving by flying to the UN and doing various climate change negotiations, decided that there was actually a solution to solve some of these things. It wasn't just pointing the finger at governments and at multilateralism to try and solve these things. And so me and a friend in 2010, while we're working for the government, decided to set up a startup called Conscious Consumers. And the idea there was, you know, can we actually empower people and businesses to actually be part of the solution to some of the big sustainability challenges that we certainly saw happening and see now. So I'm going to share a few slides just to mix it up for the last session today. Maybe you can put your thumbs up, or at least say you can see what I can see, which says CoGo. Is that right, Mike? You can see that?
Yeah, we can see it. Perfect. Yeah, thanks.
Great. So as I said, we set up this company to really solve some of the biggest challenges that we all know on this call exist. And I think the point that others have made around it being on the rise, like the concern is on the rise, no question. But I think, as I said, people now are looking more to like, how can I be part of the solution, not just you know, pointing the finger at others. So our product, we have two products. We have an app that people can download. So we're in the UK and New Zealand, about to launch in Australia, very interested in the Asian market as well, but it's a free app that people can download, and it really helps them understand their personal impact in the world. It uses lots of real-time data, which was great to hear from Pamela and Professor Masaru on. So that's our API, so that's our CoGo Direct product. It's free, people, and I'll talk to you about it in a second. The other product is an API, which basically is a real-time open data source around sustainable information, which plugs into people like banks, apps. So I'm just going to talk you through how it works. The entire underpinning of our product is around aggregating sustainable data sets and applying behavioral science to actually move people's behavior at scale. So how the CoGo Direct product works, we first ask people what they care about, and then we connect their banking data. So we use open banking protocols. We have 35 banks in the UK connected, 5 in New Zealand. And so what effectively that does is it allows us to know what people say they care about, but then also all of their financial data, and it allows us to then analyze that. One thing we do is, people talked about the aggregation of data, is we have an app that, a feature on our app which allows you to see all the different places you buy from and the sustainability performance of those businesses. And so that's an aggregation of around 130 different sort of sustainability certification programs. So that's like a Google for good business, if you like. But the real feature I want to talk to you about today is our real-time carbon footprint calculator, which allows our users in real time to see their carbon footprint based on all of their transactional spending. So we work with leading universities across the UK, New Zealand, here obviously in Australia. We basically aggregate input-output models. For those economists on the call will know what that is, but it basically allows us to translate a certain amount of spending into a carbon footprint. But while carbon footprinting is one element, we have a lot of behavioral science to get people to sort of understand that, hey, by using electric car, buying secondhand clothing, renewable energy, this is your personal impact you've had by sort of changing your behavior. And we also nudge them to sort of adopt new behaviors. So things like, hey, you know, if you went from a vegetarian diet to vegan, you'd save this much carbon. There's other people doing it, so use all the social science around how you get people to make behavior change, really. So that's one product. Quickly onto the second product. So that's our CoGo Direct product. One thing before going onto the API is that we work with banks across the world, and they promote this product to their customers. So Lloyd's in the UK, for example, can go out to their customers and say, hey, you should use CoGo. And one of the features we have is a thing called the living wage wallet, which tracks all of your spending and tells you when you buy from businesses that pay a living wage to their staff, which effectively is above the minimum. So I guess one of the features we have is this idea that banks can sort of almost gray label or white label the product, promote it to their customers and look like, which is great because there's millions of people that bank with Lloyd's, they can give this information to their customers and talk about their sustainability performance. So the last thing is just to talk you through the API. Now, some of this is confidential, so I don't mind it being recorded or within PBEC and stuff, but if you want to share it outside, maybe just come check with me first. But the API product allows us to build integrations into existing banking apps. So we've got partnerships with about 5 banks at the moment and different stages of development. where we can actually show people their carbon footprint without them having to even download our app. So it's inside the banking app. And inside the app, we can do things like getting people to set their own carbon footprint, their budget for a month, and then nudge them to adopt new behavior. So just what we do currently within CoGo, we can actually create that experience inside banking apps. We use a lot of this behavioral science, again, to nudge them. This is another app where we can see they bought something from somewhere that's, say, not the greatest, so like a coal energy generating provider of electricity, and we can say, hey, you could reduce your carbon footprint, and so nudge them to say, look, you could save 28 kilograms by moving to a renewable energy provider. So I suppose our solution, aims to touch 20 million people in 12 months. We've been around for years doing this, and we're sort of starting to get a heap of recognition, which is great. A lot of investment coming into the business, and we're raising money constantly at the moment. But ultimately, our belief is that, and I'll stop my screen now so I can actually see you all. But our belief now is to empower hundreds of millions of people around the world with information to actually help them shape the future and around issues such as climate change. And I don't know, after spending years, as I said, working in the UN and working in government, while I think government will have a role to play, no question, ultimately it's going to come down to the decisions that people make on a day-to-day basis. And in some ways, that's what's got us into this mess, so it's what's going to get us out of it. Thanks, that's all. I'm slightly under time, but pretty good. Appreciate it, Michael.
Thank you, Ben. Very efficient. And what I will do now is I'll just ask the panelists now to maybe switch back on their video, maybe stay muted for now, but we've got some questions already coming through, and I guess what I'll do is you probably can see them as well, but I'll start off with one directly for Yuki that was put in by an anonymous attendee. Would you agree that financial institutions that provide loans and issue green bonds to green eligible projects are more committed to sustainable development than those that undertake mere sustainability initiatives such as greening their buildings or reducing consumption? That means that the next step for FIs is really to support sustainable financing through issuance of bonds. May I know your thoughts? So maybe Yuki to start with, and then we'll come to one or two of the other panelists for some of the other questions.
Okay, so thank you. I think there are a few different things that are said in there. So let me unpack. First of all, I do agree that compared to their operations, banks have a bigger impact through their financing. So I do agree that greening their buildings is definitely an easy one that they should, all banks should be looking at, but that they should quickly focus on what they are financing. Now, regarding green bonds though, I'd say that actually bonds is not the main thing that the banks normally do. It's their lending business that they are best at. So like what Pamela was saying about SME lending, or their normal corporate lending or retail, these kind of things they do need to look at. So green bonds is not the only solution. And I would say that green financing is actually probably not the only solution either. The transition financing, meaning helping businesses from brown activities to more sustainable and ultimately green activities, becoming a green corporation, is the biggest impact that banks can do. So they don't need to cut off ties with any of their brown customers. They just need to have a good conversation with the brown customers and help them realize that actually their future is going to be limited if they stay brown, that the countries around the world and their supply chain, if they look at their customers, that they really need to move on and have a good strategy. So what we are seeing amongst the PRB members, the Principles for Responsible Banking members, is that their role as a banker is becoming more like an advisory role, that they are going in and talking with their customers at a very deep level. So in the past, they would have used their environmental and social expertise just to assess the bank's own risks. Today, they are using it to help customers come up with good strategies and to use their financing ability, which is normally their lending, to help customers build that transition. So I would say that that is the most biggest thing that they can do.
Mike, can I say something? What Yuki said, and I think that she's absolutely right. It's really about a comprehensive approach to banking. It's not just about green bonds and all of those. Those are good things. I'm not saying that they're not, but I think, the majority of the lending by the banks is not green bonds and green loans and all of those kind of things. It's just regular stuff. And in the past year or two, we have been working with banks to help their customers improve, because one such example is a major conglomerate out of Hong Kong. They have international businesses, and of course the bank wants to continue to do business with them, but their ESG performance poor, and that then in turn reflects poorly on the bank's scorecard. And of course, the bank wants to continue to do business. Of course, it's very profitable to have this customer. And so they kind of like brought us in to work with the company to improve. And I think that is, common practice, because it's going to be common practice going forward as they go troll through their loan book and see the laggards and see the sectors that are, probably problematic. And I think ultimately what is important is that in the end, your performance, your action or inaction, irrespective of your size or anything, is going to impact somebody else's scorecard. So in this case, it's a big conglomerate and a bank. But I mean, in Pamela's case, where she's talking about SMEs and all supply chain companies, it's really kind of like they are somebody else's supply chain. And if they don't do stuff, they will impact the score of the bigger company who may have made these commitments. All these UN fashion charter people that Pamela may know about, all the 120 kind of apparel companies and brands have signed up to this, SBTI targets and all of that. And a lot of these SMEs are their supply chain companies. So how can we, work with? I think it's more going to be towards a more partnership model than a pure customer and supply model going forward, because everybody's so connected in this world, and your inaction is going to affect somebody else.
I'll just add one thing quickly, Michael.
Go ahead.
So we work, for example, with Westpac here in New Zealand, and the question about their buildings, I agree completely. Their operational emissions are something like 7,000 tons a year, but the opportunity to reach their retail customers is 25 million tons of carbon. So it's sort of like a completely order of magnitude difference. And I think, I agree with Pat that in the case of the NatWest relationship, we actually are doing the SME carbon footprinting. So we're actually providing services to understand the SME, and they're interested in that. So is Westpac and other banks, for risk, because they don't want to be having customers that they bank with that have got higher emission intensity than others. So in some ways, it's both the bank's best interest to understand their the companies they lend to and bank with, because they don't want to be in business with companies that are not going to be in business in the future. So I think there's a lot of ways, a lot of reasons why banks need to be sort of, I guess, catalysts to sort of systemic change, massively a big opportunity.
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of they need to play their role in providing that sort of education training to their existing clients in order to sort of change the mindset of financial exclusion to inclusion. Okay, so there's a couple more questions here we've got, which I'd like to ask Pamela one here. How do you think the disparity among workers, like shifting labour relations to less responsive, such as the gig work? I don't know if that makes sense, but have you got something to say on that, Pamela?
So there's actually two shifting going on. One is from between countries, so countries with higher wage levels to lower wage levels, and then also within country, shifting from formal protected workers to informal and unprotected sectors of workers. And in both cases, the government has a key role to play in ensuring that the same protections are available to workers regardless of the entity who they're employed by. I know this is a huge issue with with the gig economy, Deliveroo and all of those. I think it's really essential that the public sector play a role in creating a level playing field. Private regulation and private commitments are good, but as we've seen, there's always lots of different ways to kind of get around those. And so definitely, within countries, getting a level playing field between the formal and informal sectors is really important, particularly in places like India, where the informal sector is actually half of the economy. And so that's a really big work. And then between countries, it is a natural process of evolution where companies go to, and supply chains go to different countries in search of different types of comparative advantage. And I don't think this is exclusive to wage. I think that that there's a lot of advantages that countries can have despite higher wage rates in terms of the availability of components, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of clustering, in terms of indigenous innovation capabilities and education, and getting that workforce who is really prepared. And so I think that's it's a healthy process to enable countries to actually try to cultivate those different sources of advantage. I think the only thing with regard to SMEs is that they tend to have less access to those capability building resources in terms of their access to workers, access to finance, access to new technology. And that's where supply chains really come into play, because supply chains are a key way for knowledge transfer to happen from developed to developing countries. And now even from developing countries where they've explored and innovated, for them to export out those advantages. But we need to basically keep the flow of knowledge going within supply chains, and in order to do that, finance is really key, which brings me back to my original point, and I'll begin sounding like a broken record, but that we really need to make sure that finance is getting to those who really actually do the work and play the roles in sustainable development.
Thank you, Pamela. I just want to bring in Kate here quickly again, and because there's a question around social impact generated from ESG investing practices, and have you seen any so far that you could share? As the person, Jericho Lee, is saying, greenwashing still prevails in the financial service industry. And I guess, I don't know if you want to touch upon some of your voluntary work, Kate, at WWF in this. I don't know if that's relevant, but maybe over to you.
Yeah, happy to take this one. So I think what's clear is that there is definitely, and I hear this a lot, that this fear of greenwashing is stopping a belief that there is an impact happening. And I think it's very important to dispel that belief, because ESG investing takes a number of different guises, and certainly ESG investing does not always mean impact. And so I think part of the issue here is really growing that level of understanding about what these different strategies are doing. Impact can obviously come in the form of an impact fund, where impact is a key objective of what the investment manager is looking to achieve. But it can also come through, alongside an ESG integration strategy where a manager is engaging. So we heard about this on the bank side. Maybe the loan is not specifically investing in an area such as green energy or an area of social impact, but through that engagement, impact can be achieved and measured and reported on. So yeah, on the social side, I think in Asia, actually, that's possibly where part of the issue is, that there's a huge focus on the environment, and actually we need to start seeing more focus on the social side. So if I look at the impact funds that we've worked on to date, it is mostly on environmental impact projects, and I think we've seen some sort of social aspects in terms of funds investing and looking at social housing. Certainly in the WWF, if we had one of the representatives from the team there, they could give you some tangible examples of this. One thing which I think is really interesting that WWF is doing is actually having a team focused on bankable nature solutions. So part of, we've got a lot of interest growing about moving capital into areas that is going to have some kind of positive impact on environmental and social issues. But banks, and actually, I'm sure Pat's getting this as well, but we're consulting with banks who are looking for these options and they're finding it difficult to find them. So I think it's really interesting that the way that an NGO can come in and partner with financial institutions and help actually provide access to these kind of projects, help identify them. So WWF is specifically at the moment incubating projects that it hopes that has identified as bankable, maybe not right now, but at some point in the future, and looking at blended capital opportunities. So that's not that's a more of a holistic overview. But I think my key message here is don't let a fear of greenwashing stop us moving forward. I think we've always had issues around representation in financial products. And we do, even without regulation, we have a way to solve issues around greenwashing. If you have a misrepresentation, you can be held account for that. And in Australia, we currently have cases going on at the moment and actually globally for financial institutions being held to account on this.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Yeah, go ahead, Yuki.
Maybe add to Kate. So the Principles for Responsible Banking is very aware of this risk of greenwashing. And so what we are doing is having lots of guidelines around target setting. How do you determine your baseline? How do you set your KPIs and how do you disclose against it? So impact management is a big part of what the PRB does. And we have a lot of target setting guidelines that are coming out now. So for social issues, we have the gender target setting, the financial inclusion and financial health guidelines, and also there will be the nature target setting around nature, and of course we follow the climate alignment targets as well. But the key thing is impact is very new in the finance sector. Excluding impact investors. What we're talking about impact here is for ordinary banks to pursue impact at the same time that they are pursuing their profit. So we are currently developing these guidelines to make sure that we have a robust, credible framework that banks can then manage their impact and disclose that properly. Thank you.
Okay, so we're running nearly out of time already, an hour and a half. So what I was thinking, instead of going through, and I've been taking a tremendous amount of notes, and what I'll do is I'll type that up and actually add it to the recording, which will go out later, and Ben will make sure I maybe take out that sensitive stuff. I would like to just finish with George. George, can I ask you for final comments? And then after George, very quickly, each one of you by unmuting, I'd like just to hear one goal that you'd like to achieve in 2021 that remains, that you're hoping to achieve. Just one very quick 30-second goal. So over to you, George, and then each one come down the line with your goal. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I think we have a consensus reach actually, and that is let's take concerted, immediate action now. Because this is very important for not just our businesses, but our community, but the whole world as well. And secondly, I like to see more momentum and support from fintech, from the startups community, because they really can make a big difference. Like tracking carbon footprint and enabling, empowering and motivating people to do more responsible investing and so on. And lastly, I think it's time for us to really put in place a responsible investment charter. We already have the framework, from the UN. I think it's really implementation. The key is implementation. Let's go for it. Thank you.
Thank you, George. So starting with with Pat, quickly, what's your one goal that you want to hope to achieve in relation to the topic today?
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, like Hong Kong has this cross-agency steering group on green and sustainable finance, and they set out this roadmap for in December 2020 for the next few years. And I think one of the key things that needs to happen is really more capacity building within the financial system. Because I think it doesn't naturally come to financial professionals, all of these ESG matters. And we really need to close that gap to accelerate some of these initiatives in finance. And that will filter through into the rest of the economy.
Okay, Pat, thank you. Kate?
My aim is working with asset managers, particularly startup and medium-sized managers in Asia, to help them raise their level of ambition when it comes to ESG investing, and working with them to identify the best tools that are out there at the moment to achieve these aims.
Perfect. Professor Yarime.
Yes. Yeah, just responding to the greenwashing, and I think one key challenge is to make the data open, repeating what I said, in the sense that that will make it possible to evaluate and assess from a more objective perspective, so that I'm going to work with the private sectors, and also I'm serving a committee to give awards for ESG reporting and sustainability reporting, so that I'm going to really encourage the data available openly, freely, so that many stakeholders can use it.
Perfect. You can nag your fellow panelists afterwards as well to get involved. Okay, over to Pamela.
Yeah, I would like to see greater partnership between finance, sustainability, and technology professionals in order to digitize more parts of the trading and finance processes in the interest of opening up financing to more small and medium-sized enterprises in general.
Thank you, Pamela. To Yuki.
Yeah, so UNEP-FI's Principles for Responsible Banking goal for this year is to help banks really gain the capacity to do their impact analysis. Impact analysis and assessment is still very difficult and nascent stages. So we are working with our banks, our signatories, on providing guidance and workshops and really helping them to integrate that into their organization.
And finally to Ben, because obviously you're in New Zealand, the APEC chair for 2021 as well.
That's right.
Any final thoughts? One goal, I should say. Maybe
our goal would be to say, let's work with 100 financial institutions to empower them to support 100 million of their customers to know about climate, to take action on climate, use open data, use all the stuff people are talking about, but put the information in the hands of the people that ultimately are day-to-day SMEs, individuals making decisions. And I think that is what we're trying to build. So yeah, we say, let's go change the world, let's CoGo. And I think that is very much like what we've heard from George. So we're all in, we're in to change the world.
Wonderful. Okay, with that, I leave it there. I just want to thank all of my distinguished panelists and speakers for today's dialogue, and our co-host ESBN, Dr. George Lam, Chairman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
With that, I want to thank also ESCAP for allowing